Winter hangs over western Russia, early 1943. The forests around Lviv are quiet in the way exhausted landscapes become quiet. Not peaceful, just emptied of sound. Snow settles into shell craters. Frozen tree trunks lean at angles that no longer look natural. In Moscow, far from the front, the war looks different. Inside a Soviet headquarters room, the air is warm, heavy with cigarette smoke and damp wool. Maps of the Western Front cover the walls, thick with red and blue arrows that overlap until they lose meaning. The city of Lviv is marked plainly, almost casually, one point among many along a front that has already consumed millions. Marshal Georgy Zhukov stands near the table, listening. Not speaking, that matters. Around him are generals who understand that silence at this level is not neutrality. It is judgment being formed. Lviv is officially described as a salient, a bulge, an inconvenience left over from earlier phases of the war. It sits too close to Moscow to ignore, but too costly to confront directly. For more than a year, Soviet forces have battered it from multiple directions, trading ground for blood in a way that never quite breaks the German grip. On paper, this moment feels different. German forces are pulling back, quietly, methodically. Their lines around Lviv are thinning. Reconnaissance reports suggest preparation for withdrawal, not collapse, but disengagement, a rare thing on the Eastern Front. The opportunity is obvious. If the Red Army moves fast enough, hard enough, it could turn a controlled German withdrawal into something else entirely. A trap, a victory that finally erases the threat west of Moscow. No one in this room doubts the importance of that. What they doubt, quietly, is the cost. The briefings are precise, almost sterile. German divisions identified by number. Estimated strength reduced by weeks of attrition. Rail traffic analyzed. Ammunition expenditure plotted on charts that try, unsuccessfully, to translate death into logistics. One intelligence officer points out that the Germans are not fleeing. They are withdrawing in order. That distinction matters. An orderly retreat can turn suddenly lethal if rushed. Another officer counters that waiting risks losing the chance altogether. If German forces disengage cleanly, Lviv disappears as a strategic target, but the war continues exactly as before. No breakthrough, no relief, no narrative shift, and narrative matters. Lviv has become an embarrassment inside the Soviet command structure. It consumes men without delivering symbolism. There are no dramatic headlines here, no heroic city names, just forests, villages, and casualty lists that grow longer with each month. The pressure is not only military, it is political. Stalin expects momentum. After Stalingrad, expectations have changed. Victories are no longer rare, they are required. The Red Army is no longer permitted to grind forward anonymously. It must prove itself. A clean success at Lviv would do that. But a messy one would raise questions no one wants asked. Field commanders submit cautious recommendations. Advance, yes, but measured. Secure flanks. Accept that the Germans may escape with much of their force intact. Preserve manpower. Those recommendations are read and set aside. Near the front, far from Moscow's heated rooms, Soviet officers stand in snow-covered dugouts, studying the same problem from a different angle. They can hear German artillery repositioning at night. They notice the change in rhythm. Fewer probes, more movement, less resistance in places that should still be contested. Something is changing. A divisional commander runs his finger along a map, tracing possible German withdrawal routes. He understands the temptation. He also understands the terrain. Forests choke movement. Roads vanish under snow. Units advancing too aggressively will outrun supply and lose cohesion. He sends his assessment upward. It is careful, respectful, not alarmist. He does not say this will cost too much. He says this may not deliver what is expected. The message disappears into the system. Above him, the logic of opportunity has already taken hold. Back in Moscow, the language shifts. What was once a possible operation becomes a necessary one. The goal subtly changes from managing a German withdrawal to destroying the enemy force outright. That change is not announced. It simply appears in phrasing. Exploit the situation. Deny the enemy freedom of maneuver. Prevent an organized retreat. Each phrase sounds reasonable on its own. Together, they demand speed, aggression, and risk. Zhukov listens as timelines are discussed. The Red Army has numbers, artillery, momentum from recent victories. The belief that German forces are no longer capable of absorbing punishment the way they once did. No one says it aloud, but everyone feels it. If the Red Army cannot deliver a decisive result now, then when? There is one complication that keeps resurfacing: casualties. The numbers projected are high. Not catastrophic, but uncomfortable. They do not fit easily into the triumphant story the war has begun to tell itself. The response to this concern is subtle. Casualties are framed as temporary. Losses are described as acceptable given the stakes. And Rzew is redefined, not as a forested salient, but as a lingering threat to Moscow itself. Threats justify sacrifice. Outside the room, snow continues to fall. Orders begin to move, not as final directives, but as preparations. Artillery concentrations, infantry realignments, timetables drafted with aggressive assumptions built into every line. No one declares that this battle must succeed at any cost, but the structure forming around it makes failure increasingly unacceptable. At Rzew, Soviet soldiers prepare to advance once more into terrain that has already taken too much from them. They do not know that this operation, if successful, will later become something the state struggles to explain. They only know they are being asked to move forward, again, into silence. The battle has not begun, but the conditions that will define how it is remembered or forgotten are already in place. The front line near Rzew does not erupt, it unfolds. At first light, Soviet artillery opens fire with methodical precision. Not a barrage meant to shock, but a measured pressure, designed to pin, probe, and test. Snow jumps from the ground in dull bursts. Trees splinter. The sound rolls outward, then settles into rhythm. Infantry advances behind it, not charging, but moving the way men move when they've been told this time might be different. In command posts along the front, officers track progress with pencils and grease markers. Early reports are encouraging. German resistance appears thinner. Some positions are abandoned outright. Prisoners are taken, tired, cold, unsurprised. The operation begins to feel justified. That feeling spreads fast. By midday, optimism hardens into expectation. Units push forward into areas that had resisted for months. Villages fall with less fighting than anticipated. German rearguards delay, then withdraw. The signs all point one way: the enemy is leaving. This is where pressure enters the system. Higher headquarters interprets movement as collapse. Orders adjust accordingly, not formally, but in tone. Commanders are encouraged to press harder, move faster, exploit weakness before it disappears. What had been a pursuit becomes a chase. Field officers begin to notice the costs immediately. Artillery cannot keep pace. Supply columns struggle through snow-choked roads. Infantry units advance beyond reliable communication range. Flanks stretch thin, guarded by formations already depleted by previous fighting. Reports describing these issues move upward. They are acknowledged. They are not acted on. because the operation now carries a promise. If pressure is maintained, the German withdrawal can be transformed into annihilation. That promise becomes intoxicating. In one sector, a Soviet corps commander pauses his advance. Not out of fear, but calculation. His reconnaissance units report German forces pulling back in disciplined stages, using terrain intelligently. This is not a rout. It is a controlled disengagement designed to punish pursuit. He requests permission to consolidate before advancing further. The reply arrives hours later. Continue pressure. Enemy retreat indicates weakness. The language is polite. The message is clear. Inside the Soviet command structure, two interpretations now coexist, uneasily. One sees success unfolding exactly as hoped. German lines thinning, momentum building, opportunity opening. The other sees danger, an enemy choosing where to fight next, not one being forced into it. The problem is not that dissent exists. It's that dissent no longer aligns with the emotional direction of the campaign. After months of attritional stalemate around Zhev, commanders want resolution. Political leadership wants results that can be named, framed, and eventually celebrated. A partial victory is no longer enough. Casualty reports begin to climb, not explosively, but steadily. Units advancing into exposed ground take losses from artillery and ambush. German counterfire remains disciplined. Retreating units turn suddenly, strike, and disappear again. The Red Army is advancing, but it is paying for every kilometer. Those costs are logged, not emphasized. The fracture becomes visible when German resistance stiffens abruptly. In several sectors, Soviet spearheads run into prepared defensive positions, far stronger than expected. Machine gun nests, pre-registered artillery, minefields laid not to hold ground, but to punish momentum. What looked like abandonment reveals itself as shaping. German forces are not trying to stop the Soviet advance everywhere. They are choosing where it hurts. Soviet units take heavy casualties attempting to maintain pressure. Commanders hesitate, then push again, aware that slowing now may be interpreted as hesitation, not prudence. The advance continues, but its character has changed. What was meant to be exploitation now resembles attrition once more. As night falls, frontline reports become shorter, more factual, less hopeful. Progress continues, but at rising cost. The enemy withdraws, but not broken. The Red Army moves forward, but increasingly disorganized. Inside headquarters, no one declares failure. The operation is still officially succeeding, but something essential has shifted. The question is no longer whether the Germans can be destroyed. It is whether the Red Army can afford the price being demanded for that attempt. That question remains unanswered, for now. The meeting takes place far from the front. In Moscow, inside a room built to project certainty, maps of the Zhev salient cover a long table. Pins mark advances made over days that feel longer than they should. Lines creep westward, slow, costly progress rendered clean on paper. The men around the table are not panicking. That is what makes the moment dangerous. They see movement. They see pressure applied. They see the possibility, still faint but real, of forcing the Germans out of a position that has drained Soviet manpower for more than a year. This operation has already consumed too much to stop halfway. Stopping now would mean admitting something no one wants to say aloud, that the price paid so far may not produce a victory dramatic enough to justify it. Reports arrive from the front in uneven rhythm. Some describe continued German withdrawal. Others warn of mounting losses and exhausted units. A few mention something more troubling. Enemy formations slipping away intact, abandoning ground but preserving strength. This suggests a different reality. The Germans may not be collapsing. They may be disengaging on their own terms. Several senior officers recognize the implication immediately. If the enemy is executing a controlled withdrawal, then continuing to press forward aggressively risks turning Soviet momentum into a trap, drawing forces deeper into zones where firepower and terrain favor the defender. A proposal circulates quietly. Pause the offensive. Reorganize. Claim what has been gained and let the enemy go. It is not cowardice, it is strategy. But strategy, at this moment, collides with something else. Narrative. The decision does not arrive as a dramatic command. It arrives as an absence. No order to pause is issued. No authorization to disengage is given. No adjustment is made to the operational tempo. Instead, existing directives are reaffirmed. Maintain pressure. Exploit success. Prevent the enemy from stabilizing. On paper, nothing changes. In reality, everything does. This is the point of no return. By choosing not to stop, Soviet leadership commits fully, not just to winning ground, but to proving that the ground matters enough to justify the cost already paid. From this moment forward, the operation is no longer evaluated by outcome. It is evaluated by endurance. Field commanders understand immediately what this means. There will be no graceful conclusion, no moment where success can be declared cleanly, only continued fighting until the enemy leaves, or Soviet forces can no longer advance. The offensive becomes self-sustaining, not because it must succeed, but because stopping would expose too much. The consequences arrive faster than expected. German resistance intensifies, not everywhere, but precisely where Soviet units are most committed. Withdrawal routes close behind advancing formations. Artillery concentrations find their range. Counterattacks strike exposed flanks, not to retake territory, but to bleed momentum. Casualties spike, not in one catastrophic moment, but in relentless accumulation. Entire battalions are ground down, securing villages that will be abandoned days later. Gains are measured in meters, losses in hundreds. And still, the advance continues. Because now it has to. Pulling back would not only concede ground, it would concede meaning. By the time German forces finally disengage from the Rzew salient, there is no celebration, no announcement, no triumphant communique. The enemy is gone, but not destroyed. The Red Army holds ground that is strategically ambiguous and operationally exhausted. The cost, once tallied, is staggering, and that is when the final realization sets in. This was a victory, but it is a victory that does not fit. Too many dead, too little to show, too much improvisation, too many decisions that contradict the image of effortless, decisive command. The operation succeeded militarily, and in doing so, created a problem no one knows how to talk about. The front grows quiet in an unnatural way. Snow settles into churned earth around Rzew. Burned-out villages stand half-occupied, half-abandoned. The guns have not stopped, but they have lost urgency. The sound is intermittent now, routine, almost administrative. Inside field headquarters, officers read casualty summaries without comment. Numbers are circled, recalculated, crossed out, written again. No one argues the figures. They argue what to do with them. The operation has achieved its immediate objective. The salient is gone. German forces have pulled back. On maps, the line is straighter. In reality, the Red Army is hollowed. The pressure shifts away from the battlefield and toward the story. In Moscow, briefings change tone. The question is no longer how the battle was fought, but how it will be remembered. Draft communiques circulate. Language is tested, rejected, softened. Words like breakthrough feel dishonest. Words like encirclement invite scrutiny. Words like decisive demand proof no one can cleanly provide. Casualty figures are the real problem. They are not exaggerated by enemies. They are not invented by critics. They are Soviet numbers, compiled by Soviet officers, too high to ignore and too high to explain without admitting uncomfortable truths about command friction, improvisation, and losses incurred for terrain that now feels abstract. A quiet directive emerges. Reduce emphasis. Limit discussion. Fold the operation into the broader narrative of relentless advance. Commanders associated with the battle are reassigned. Not punished, not praised, moved sideways, out of focus. The victory begins to disappear. The shock is not public, it is internal. Veterans return from the front to find their battle unmentioned. No medals arrive, no citations follow. Memoirs referencing the operation stall in review. Archives receive files stamped restricted without explanation. The silence is deliberate. Not because the battle failed, but because it succeeded in a way that contradicts the mythology being constructed around the war. This victory reveals too much. That German withdrawals can be misread as collapses. That Soviet success can depend on attrition rather than maneuver. That command decisions were reactive, not omniscient. These truths are not useful. So the operation is absorbed into the noise of the front, stripped of specificity, reduced to a footnote between more convenient triumphs. Years later, the ground around Ljev remains heavy with memory. Local graves outnumber official plaques. Veterans speak cautiously, if at all. Historians encounter gaps. Weeks compressed into paragraphs. Losses summarized without context. The silence holds. The state does not deny the battle, it simply declines to explain it. Because some victories cost too much clarity, and some truths once acknowledged complicate everything that comes after. Years later, the war exists mostly in monuments. In Moscow, banners commemorate victories with clean lines and clear outcomes. Stalingrad, Kursk, Berlin. Each name fits neatly into a story of momentum and inevitability. Ljev does not. In archives, its files are thin. Operational maps lack commentary. Casualty tables are aggregated, anonymized, blurred into larger offensives. The battle survives not as a chapter, but as residue, numbers without narrative. Former commanders avoid the subject in interviews. When asked, they deflect toward the overall situation. Veterans speak only among themselves, using shorthand that assumes shared memory but expects no audience. Silence has become policy by habit. As decades pass, the pressure returns, not from the state, but from historians. Postwar memoirs surface with inconsistencies. German records contradict Soviet summaries. Western researchers notice anomalies, unusually high losses paired with strangely muted recognition. Questions accumulate. Why did such a costly operation produce so little public acknowledgement? Why were experienced commanders quietly sidelined afterward? Why does the language shift so abruptly around this period? Inside Russia, these questions remain sensitive, not because they challenge victory, but because they challenge how victory is understood. Ljev does not fit the template of heroic progression. It exposes war as grinding, uncertain, and brutally transactional, and that is precisely why it resists commemoration. The shock comes not with revelation, but with realization. When the battle is finally discussed openly by modern historians, nothing dramatic changes. No monuments fall, no heroes are unmade. What changes is interpretation. Ljev is understood not as an anomaly, but as a pattern. One of many moments where the Soviet war effort succeeded through endurance rather than elegance, persistence rather than brilliance. The silence was never about shame. It was about control. To acknowledge this victory fully would require acknowledging that survival sometimes mattered more than strategy, and that command certainty often followed outcomes rather than guided them. Today, Rzhev exists in the margins, not forgotten, but unresolved. Its fields remain unremarkable. Its losses remain disproportionate. Its lessons remain uncomfortable. The battle the Soviets won, and then chose not to talk about, was not buried because it failed. It was buried because it told the truth too plainly, that wars are often won without clarity, that victories can contradict ideology, that silence, like propaganda, is a deliberate act. History remembers what states choose to explain, and sometimes what they choose to leave quiet matters just as much.